Please join me in welcoming Brigadier General Blofeld. He is the J3N, Director of Nuclear Operations.
Please really sit down. Hey, well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, sir. Come on, this is USSTRATCOM. My AU brothers know how this goes. You work in one of the most exciting places on the planet, so there should be a little more enthusiasm. Say good morning, everybody. Good morning. A little better. So, hey, today is a really exciting day. First of all, welcome to my AU brothers. It's great to have you guys here and to see you all again. And a special treat for us here at STRATCOM to be able to have this kind of opportunity to do something that we don't really get to do enough of here. If I just took a quick poll, this is the audience participation, how many of you feel like you have plenty of time in your schedule every day to stop and think strategically about things? Yeah, okay, one, maybe two, there's a couple. Oh, well, I tell you, this is something that I struggle with terribly. I find myself quickly drugged by daily operations to the tactical level of things and struggling to try and think bigger thoughts, and then you just kind of look in the mirror when you're washing your hands after the one head break you got all day, and you realize your patch says Strategic Command. And we're supposed to be focused at that level, and everything that we do operationally is supposed to affect that strategic level of warfare and of the balance of the stability of the planet kind of things. But often we just get drugged down the tactical, don't we? We're fighting the closest alligator to the boat. We're fighting for whatever the 10-meter target is we're trying to take down, and we don't even see the threat that's really going to kill us 10 meters further down. We need to stop sometimes and back off and create space for ourselves to think about things bigger than just those close-in threats. And today is one of those unique opportunities to do that, which we have especially, we're fortunate to have some help from our folks at Air University, which are really open-minded, big thinkers, folks who are doing relevant research that affect real-world problems today. And we're fortunate to have them here today to help guide you all through some discussions and show you some things, to spark some of those circuits, to clear some of those cobwebs out, and begin to think about things a little broader. Some of the topics today, you might be going, man, at first blush, I don't see how that relates at all to what we're doing every day, or what we would. But that's not the purpose. It shouldn't be immediately relevant to something you're trying to solve today. It's supposed to inform you about things that are maybe, you haven't thought about before. Things that are maybe in the future, or could be possible futures for our command, and what the impacts of those things would be like for us and for our international security environment and our roles. And maybe you'll find somehow it relates to something different than you perceived, that you didn't realize there was a relationship there that you didn't understand existed at first. So please stay open-minded. The fact that you're just here already shows your commitment to that kind of thinking, that kind of opportunity to stretch your mind a little bit, think a little broader. We're in a terribly complex security environment. You all have seen that our adversaries grow more and more capable. Our competitive edge and advantage over adversaries is shrinking. I think we're still ahead, but it's certainly narrowing. That gap is narrowing. There are challengers to the international order that we have not seen. This type of challenge to the rules-based societies and international order we've had. There's a lot going on. Unfortunately for us at Strategic Command, business is good. Business is really good, but we want to get out of that business and have it be the opposite, where we're bored and we have much more time to think about bigger things than the current problem set today with you name the adversary. So welcome once again. Thank you all for participating today. I think you're going to enjoy it very much. I spent 2 years with these folks at Air University and just felt blessed every day because I just felt like I was being sharpened every single day. I had the opportunity just to be the receiver of the wisdom and the careful thought and the deep research and the lifelong scholarship that men and women down at Air University put into their studies and presentations like this. And it's really great to take some time to really stop and step back and think strategically. So you all already have an A in my book for just being here today. And again, today, come in with an open mind and really try and stretch yourself to think about what connective tissue is there between some of the things you're going to hear today about violent extremism that we don't deal with really at the tactical and operational level like some of our geographic combatant command brothers and sisters do. But certainly VEO is a concern for us with strategic operations around the world, and how do we protect ourselves from it? How do we make sure we are aware of where that threat is going and how it's evolving for things it may not be doing today, but it may do in the future. like I said, this is a great opportunity to start working through those things in your mind. And again, it may trigger some other new challenging area that you want to explore or will be helpful to our mission set that's even more beneficial than what it looks like at face value. So, congrats again for being here. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. My only regret is that I wish my schedule afforded me the opportunity to spend 3 hours with you here, but I probably got to go pile back into some kind of fire and fight the tactical today for a while. But I will be thinking about y'all, and if y'all could shoot me a copy of the slides, I would love to at least get to work through the slides, so if I got questions when I do get my little strategic time to be able to think through and give you a call if I've got any questions or want to discuss things any further myself. So, thank you. Thanks, sir. Super. Welcome again. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Enjoy. Keep your seats. Keep seats.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to go over just the genesis of this very quickly, how it relates to General Hyten's mission and intent, and then I will introduce our first speaker. General Kofeld did mention a lot of stuff, and to that end, I want to thank members from the Nebraska National Guard here, Brigadier General Lyons, thank you for taking your time, and members of academia from University of Nebraska. I'm not from Nebraska, I'm from Iowa. I'm told there's a university here. So before I get beaten, the purpose of this is twofold. One is to interact, have our analysts and some of the workers here at STRATCOM interact with academia. And as the general said, hey, let's not fight the alligator that's closest to the boat. Let's see the target down the road that's going to kill us. I can paraphrase my remarks now because of what he said. But second, and the most important thing is I wanted to create a venue and an event that was easily reproducible by anybody within the STRATCOM J codes. So we're hoping that this goes well. And my partner in crime, who I'll introduce later, we do have a strategic agenda for this that will hopefully catch fire and start moving down the road. But General Hyten issued the last commander's, not the latest commander's call, but the commander's call previous to that. He issued a challenge. He said, I want you guys to try something different. I want you to try something new. Even if it's a dismal failure, you've learned through whatever you did and you can make it better. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do something different today. And so General Hyten's challenge and a conversation with Mr. Honey, our DIA LNO, in the hallway is really what kind of inspired this. We were talking about a prison break in France. And what was remarkable about this prison break, was a store-bought drone quadcopter assisted in a site recon for an actual helicopter insertion to free an inmate at a French prison. So in other words, common criminals use an ISR platform during an IPB to facilitate a successful exfiltration mission. The news article called it a Hollywood-style prison break. I call it TTP used by the U.S. military. Sounds a lot like what we do. This is becoming more common. This sparked more back and forth with Mr. Honey and I. And I said, hey, I know some guys who write some books at the Air War College. And being the good Army officer he was, fingers extended and joint, thumb pointed downward, he poked me in the chest. He said, you go do the logistics and I will back you. And he was good to his word. And less than 3 months later, here we are, trying something new, taking General Hyten's challenge, and hopefully this is something different, and hopefully you guys enjoy. I know this is STRATCOM, you guys have other things to do, so I'm going to give you a rough outline of what we're going to do and the timeline, so if you have to prioritize on what you want to hear, you can go and come back, and that's another way we wanted to run this. We realize it is kind of a marathon, so please excuse yourselves, get up when you need to, come back when you need to, that is more than allowed. So here in 2 minutes, 9:15, Dr. Springer, who's standing behind me like a creeper, and I'll explain that a little bit later. He's going to talk about military robotics.
You smell different when you're awake.
I was telling you. Dr. Pavelec, about 9:10, we'll do future warfare. We're going to have comfort breaks in between there. And about 10:50, 10:45-ish, Lieutenant Colonel Hoffman is going to talk about terrorism, present and future. And then after that, about the 11:30 hour, we are going to do the roundtable forum. So that's a brief outline. Now, again, with your questions, please remain respectful and respect the classification that we're at. Some of you who have the above topsecret.com clearances, just keep in mind that this is unclassed. Now, Dr. Paul Springer, and one of the reasons really why we're here, he's a professor of comparative military studies and a chair at the Department of the Air chair of the Department of Research at the Air Command and Staff College. He holds a doctorate from Texas A&M, which I'm told is another university somewhere. Dr. Springer is an author of multiple books, including the one he's going to talk about here today. But more importantly, he is a graduate of the very esteemed Urbandale Middle School and High School in Urbandale, Iowa, which is where we went to school together. So we have a long sordid history, and I think you might see some real-life issues of a demonstration of deterrence. I have stories, he has stories. We'll see if those stories come out. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul Springer.
Thanks a lot for coming out. As Zach said, the two of us have known each other for most of our lives. He's got enough dirt on me that when he called me down at ACSC and said, hey, I need you to fly up to STRATCOM on the ACSC dime and give some talks to whoever wants to show up, I didn't have a lot of choice, so here I am. Super excited to be here. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think STRATCOM is a fantastic organization, so please don't think that I'm suggesting that you're becoming obsolete or anything like that. What I'm going to talk about, though, is a new emerging technology that, in my estimation, is going to fundamentally transform both the nature and the character of warfare. You may not think that military robotics have significant strategic effects, but you may also not realize that less than 2 years ago, some Russian operatives flew a small quadcopter over some security barriers, dropped off a single thermite grenade, and touched off a massive ammunition explosion in a Ukrainian bunker that did an estimated $100 million worth of damage. As a result of the resulting explosion, they actually had to evacuate a city of more than 100,000 people. Not only was this one of the largest man-made explosions of the 21st century, the Russians managed to do the same feat 3 more times, which suggested that the Ukrainians were really struggling to deal with this new form of threat that could weave its way into and out of traditional barriers without any real trouble. It also suggests that the Ukrainians probably should not leave enormous stockpiles of ammunition just kind of stacked in crates everywhere, but that's neither here nor there. Now, I'll open up with a quick disclaimer, and I hope, I should, I may not. I don't know. Let's try the connect button. How's that sound?
Technology.
Nothing but the best. There will be a brief operational pause as we try to figure out how this is going to work. And if we don't get it, no worries. Basically, I just wanted to say that this is my viewpoint. It's not the viewpoint of the Air Force, certainly. It's not the viewpoint of the Air Command and Staff College. The same is going to be true for both of my colleagues. We have spent years of our lives dedicated to these subjects, trying to learn as much as we can about them and drawing what we see as the logical conclusions. That does not mean that we expect you to agree with us. I have had multiple instances where I honestly thought an Air Command and Staff College student in uniform was going to hit me at the end of one of these talks. And so if you feel that way, go ahead. I was kind of born to be punched. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the fundamental argument I'm trying to make, and I don't expect you to read through the whole slide, and I'm certainly not going to read it for you. I will just summarize. What I see going on right now is a revolution in military affairs. This is a fundamental change in how conflicts are propagated, when one decides to go to war, how one chooses to conduct war. And that revolution in military affairs is going to fundamentally alter the nature of conflict. The RMA in question that I'm dealing with is the development, the expansion, and the deployment of military robotics. It is my contention that they are going to fundamentally alter the laws of war. They are going to trigger changes in our perception of the ethics of conflict. And they're also going to alter really the calculus of whether or not we will actually conduct warfare. It is my contention that other countries are competing with us in this domain, and that the United States has essentially a lot of incentive to maintain its current lead, but also to try to prohibit some of the worst developments that could potentially emerge, preferably through an international ban on autonomous, offensive, lethal machines. Essentially, machines that can make the decision to take a life on their own, without human intervention, no person in the loop, in an offensive capacity. That's the argument that I'm going to be working. Next slide, please. Nikolai Orgarkov, I love the opportunity to talk about a Soviet at STRATCOM. It seems just kind of naughty in its own way. Nikolai Orgarkov really popularized the concept of an RMA. He defined it as anything that fundamentally alters warfare. Now, typically, we think about it in terms of technological change. You might have heard terminology like offsets. We might have talked about fundamental changes in war. It can also be doctrinal. It can be organizational. It can be just a brand new concept, or it can be a new form of hardware. My argument is that robotics are both a hardware and a strategic change in the means of conflict that's available to us. Next slide, please. To illustrate this point, like any good historian, I need to go back 600 years. I want to pick an event that, quite frankly, we all agree changed the nature of war, and that's the gunpowder revolution. At no time in human history did a gunpowder-wielding country ever lose a war to a non-gunpowder country. There were occasional examples of gunpowder weapons losing a battle, but we never saw them actually lose a war. The point being, if you had gunpowder and your opponent did not, it was only a matter of time before you could achieve a total and complete victory. So, if we go back to the medieval period, what we see are a few examples from the High Middle Ages of how long it took to carry out a siege against a fortified position. And these are all sieges that actually succeeded in capturing their objective. As you can see, it could take months, an entire campaign season, to take a single point. And the states of Europe had largely begun fortifying their frontiers in such a way that it would take you decades to actually effect an entire conquest, assuming you could hold on to all of the fortified points that you had managed to take. You can see the art of fortification in this picture. Next slide, please. However, as gunpowder became prevalent in Europe, it became possible to fire projectiles at a high velocity, and the high curtain walls that characterized castles and other fortifications became a vulnerability. It was almost impossible to miss them. And even rudimentary cannons, some of which were actually constructed out of hollowed out trees or even hardened leather, could fire stone projectiles fast enough to punch holes in castle walls and cause their collapse. Next slide, please. As a result, in the late Middle Ages, what we see is a massive change in how long successful sieges required. Essentially, until the defensive mindset changed, sitting in a castle was about the worst thing that you could do, because it gave a vulnerable point where your enemy knew that they could find you, they could trap you, and they could batter you into submission. Not surprisingly, humans began to innovate. They came up with new defensive structures. And if you look on the lower right-hand side there, you essentially see a cutout of what those new defensive structures looked like. You still had a wall, however, that wall was actually protected by an earthen rampart leading up to it and eliminating the ability to have clear lines of fire against the walls. The walls themselves were no longer constructed of solid masonry. Rather, they were reinforced by earthworks that could absorb the blows of gunpowder projectiles. Next slide, please. Over time, you actually incorporated essentially geometry and scientific principles to create incredibly fortified cities. This is one example, and you can see the designers of this fortified position have created a whole host of defense in-depth obstacles and firing lanes to make it almost impossible to approach with any degree of force. Next slide, please. As a result, the length of sieges goes back up. We essentially get a return to stasis, and once again it becomes almost impossible to carry out warfare on a large scale because you cannot bypass these fortifications, you cannot leave them in the rear. So if you want to actually conquer a large enemy state, you're looking at an undertaking that might take more than one lifetime. Next slide, please. Because conquering fortifications became so difficult, most of the Europeans wielding gunpowder would engage in a form of warfare that involved ravaging the countryside and trying to force the enemy to come out to fight. Because of that, they began experimenting with new formations that would allow them to take advantage of their gunpowder weapons. This is the Spanish tercio. This particular formation might encompass as many as 5,000 troops in a single moving unit. It has the advantage in that it has both musketeers who can fire for range and pikemen who can defend them as they reload their muskets. The reload time is about 2 minutes at the time of the tercio. So in that time period, it became very possible for an enemy formation to literally ride across the field and hit you with a large pointed object. As a result, they needed to come up with defensive structures. The Tercio had the disadvantage that it was very unwieldy. It's hard to get 5,000 people moving in the same direction at the same time. It was very slow. It had the ability to fire in any direction, but overall, only about a quarter of its troops could bring their firepower to bear in any particular event. Next slide, please. The Swedes actually came up with what they called the brigade system. And what they did was the beginnings of linear tactics. Now, when they did that, they still had the advantage of their musketeers being able to fire at range and their pikemen being able to protect them. But the formation was not interlaced, and as a result, it could actually move quite a bit faster. It was a lot more flexible on the battlefield. It offered a lot more freedom of movement to Gustavus Adolphus and his successors. Next slide, please. As a result, when the Swedish squadrons under their brigade system met up with tercios under Holy Roman Empire troops, the Swedes managed to sweep the battlefield. This is one of the rare times that you'll hear a military historian refer to Swedish military dominance. But for a brief period of time, the Swedes were the cream of the crop in Europe in terms of their capabilities. So gunpowder is widely regarded as a result as a clear RMA. There's no country that has ever really thought, that wasn't worth the trouble, let's not do that anymore. And as a result, it's become the norm. Next slide, please. However, it did not stop developing. We got the incorporation of cartridges, automatic weapons, high rates of fire. And by World War I, what you see is a squad-operated machine gun that's water-cooled, capable of firing 600 rounds per minute of sustained fire, that can actually fire accurately up to 2 miles. This made it almost impossible for armies to actually face each other in the field without just resorting to an attritional nightmare struggle. Next slide, please. How we conduct war today. It's not like we just suddenly sat down and said, gosh, here's how we ought to do things. Here's what the limits should be. We all agree there are some things in war you do not do, and that if you do them, you are outside the norms, outside the acceptable behavior in conflict. A lot of those norms are actually hundreds of years old. On the far left is a guy named Grotius. Now, Grotius is writing during the 30 Years' War in Europe. The 30 Years' War lasts from 1618 to 1648. It encompasses all of Central Europe. Pretty much everybody gets involved. They all have gunpowder weapons. It's an absolute slaughter. The German population, for example, goes down 50% during this war. The overall European population probably down between 25 and 30%. It is a catastrophic struggle between Catholics and Protestants for dominance on the continent. And as we've seen, neither one of them really wins. There are Catholic countries, there are Protestant countries. They have learned how to live in harmony. During the 30 Years' War, there was very little agreement about what you could and could not do, particularly if the enemy was an unwashed heathen on the other side of the religious divide. As far as the combatants were concerned, the individuals that they were facing, whether they be Catholic or Protestant, were inherently dangerous because they held such irreligious beliefs. There was no reconciliation between these two positions. Not only did my enemy represent a threat to me, my enemy's ideas and belief structure represented a threat to my children because they might corrupt them into what I saw as the wrong religious answer. Essentially, I see the enemy trying to consign my children, my family, to an afterlife of eternal torment. That's kind of a motivator for me, and I'm going to do everything in my power to eliminate that idea. Grotius winds up getting swept up in the fighting. He spends about 10 years as a prisoner of war, and when he emerges, he starts to write what he calls essentially justice in war, justice in peace. What he's trying to do is set out what the limits should be for civilized societies. He basically says you shouldn't just slaughter prisoners, for example. You should accept taking prisoners, holding them, and then returning them at the end of a conflict. You should not slaughter civilians. You should not just bombard a city with artillery fire. And he starts to create these norms which gradually become accepted throughout European society and then get incorporated into international law. He's followed by Emmerich de Vattel and Montesquieu, both of whom have ideas that might civilize war. Now, they all assume that war will always be part of the human condition, but they're suggesting that you can fight wars without regressing to the worst of all possible behaviors. Next slide, please. If we fast forward to today, there's an awful lot of people that this cartoon resonates with. The assumption that the enemy gets to do whatever they want and we are stuck following an old rule book that might have become obsolete. And there is some truth to that. If you've ever wondered why we have to follow the rules even when we're facing an enemy that does not, the reality is, if you read the Geneva Convention closely, it suggests you don't exactly have to follow the rules if the enemy is not following them either. In order to be a lawful combatant, one must wear a uniform or some other recognizable device. One must bear arms openly. One must have a hierarchical structure where the leaders are responsible for the behavior of subordinates. And one must follow the laws of war. Groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State tend to fail on all four counts. That does not mean that it's open season and you should slaughter them at every opportunity. But it does mean they may not be able to claim the protections that some individuals would suggest. Why does this matter? Because this influences how we go about conflict. It determines the types of behaviors that we're willing to engage in. And the reason that we absolutely have to follow the laws, as irritating as it might be sometimes, is found when you look at the fundamental goals of groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. While those two groups absolutely hate each other, and Colonel Hoffman will talk more about that in a little while, both of them agree that what they think they would like in the future is a caliphate. Essentially, one nation united under a religious political leader that encompasses all Sunni Muslim territory in the world. Were such a caliphate to emerge, it would immediately be considered a superpower on any measure. Whether you think about it economically, geographically, socially, etc., this would be a power to be reckoned with. And none of the big five at the United Nations is going to tolerate the emergence of a caliphate. They can't, because it would be a threat, a unique threat, to all five of the UN Permanent Security Council members. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State know that. They need to not only drive Westerners out of the Middle East, they need to actually destroy the existing world order. They need to pull down the United Nations and all of our assumptions and underpinnings about the laws of armed conflict if they're going to achieve their ultimate goal. Essentially, we can't ask them to follow the laws of armed conflict because we know they won't do it. And they won't do it because following the rules would mean accepting the rules. And accepting the rules would mean accepting the world order. A world order that largely exists to prevent you from achieving what you want. Next slide, please. Now, we need a few definitions before we move into the robotics section here. We hear the term drone in the media on a regular basis. And drones have been in existence for a long time. Drones do whatever they're told to do. They don't make choices, they just follow orders. Next slide, please. A robotic system has what's called limited autonomy. It can make some decisions, but those decisions will usually be essentially grounded. It will have a decision tree to select from. It will not be really making a lot of choices for itself. It will simply be selecting the best possible option. More often than not, robotic systems are under the control of an operator. It might be in an industrial setting, assembling cars. It might be in a military setting where we have remotely piloted aircraft and remotely piloted ground vehicles. These can be armed. Most of them are not. Next slide, please. A true robot, under the classical definition, there are very few that are even experimental at this point, but these have the ability to sense their environment and react to it appropriately. They have true independent decision-making capability, not a pre-programmed list of things to choose from, but rather they react as appropriate to their environment. And that's why I use all of these popular culture examples, because that's what Americans have become comfortable with when we think about robots. Now, a brief tangent, next slide please. Cyborgs, a cybernetic organism. A cyborg incorporates some aspect of robotic or artificial enhancements into their body. And there are plenty of cyborgs wandering around right now. Statistically, there's probably at least one or two in the audience here. Cochlear implants, for example, technically turn one into a cyborg in most cases. That's why Rush Limbaugh is in the lower right-hand corner there. Without his cochlear implants, he would be deaf. He would not be capable of carrying out his radio program anymore. But when we hear cyborg, we often think, once again, of sci-fi technology. In reality, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are going to incorporate substantial amounts of robotic technology into our bodies. So those that are worried about a robotic takeover might feel better knowing that it's entirely likely that we will become, in many ways, the systems that we currently most fear. Any of you that has ever raised a teenager, ask yourself, if they could have a cell phone grafted into their head, would they do it? I would argue that an awful lot of them would. Next slide, please. Okay, artificial intelligence. We often hear the term bandied about, that artificial intelligence is this machine that's going to think better than humans, but it'll think like humans, and when that moment happens, it'll be called the singularity, and everything will change, and there will never be a way to predict what happens after it. The reality is artificial intelligence has existed for an incredibly long time. It just tends to be extremely focused. For example, a small calculator is a form of artificial intelligence. It only does one thing, arithmetic, but it does it very fast, better than humans can. Artificial intelligence in many ways is a red herring. We're not trying to replicate the human mind. There's very few applications that would cause you to want to do so. Instead, what we're trying to do is improve upon specific processes and make them automated and faster. So we see, for example, a couple of point defense weapons down at the bottom of the screen here. Whether it's the Sea-Whiz system on naval ships, whether it's a Patriot missile battery, these are both examples of last-ditch efforts to defend against a single point in space. Humans can't think fast enough and react fast enough to fire those weapons accurately. Their real function when you turn them in full autonomous mode, the only real function of a human is to turn it on and to turn it back off again. Now, we only use them in certain circumstances. We don't have these things all over the place because they are dangerous. And there have been a lot of accidents associated with these types of devices. Their intelligence is limited. They can't always discriminate between what they ought to be aiming for and what they think they ought to be aiming for. They also have a bad track record when it comes to checking what's behind the target. So, for example, during the Persian Gulf War, the Iraqis fired a Silkworm missile at some American naval vessels. Our Sea-Whiz engaged against it and missed, but it did actually fire a whole round, a whole slew of rounds, quite frankly, across the deck of another American warship, killing one individual and wounding a couple more. The South Africans created a basically self-aware, for lack of a better term, air defense cannon. They decided to show it off to a whole bunch of general officers. So, sir, you might want to plug your ears for this one. The general officers file in. They set themselves up on a series of bleachers. It's going to be a live fire test, so they're going to fire basically a drone overhead for this thing to shoot at. Before the drone gets fired, they turn on the gun. It powers up, and it immediately engages against the bleachers. And the reason why is because there was a portable toilet with a built-in electric fan right behind the bleachers, and the fan was actually oscillating at the same frequency as the one on the programmed drone. So it thought it was engaging the target it was designed to engage. 9 people were killed, including a second lieutenant, who charged the gun and managed to essentially disconnect the power supply while being killed in the process. Next slide, please. On that happy note. Cyber, in some ways, represents the greatest possibility for artificial intelligence being brought onto the battlefield. Cyber creates the possibility of having the same effect as a kinetic strike without necessarily subjecting yourself to the danger. And also, cyber, we're not quite sure exactly how it's going to fit right now into the laws of armed conflict. We know if you bomb a reactor, such as the one on the lower right-hand side there, that can be construed as an act of war. It is an armed kinetic attack on enemy soil. In this case, in Operation Orchard, the Israelis struck a Syrian site. We know that the site was a nuclear reactor, although the Syrians tried to pretend that it had never existed and just bulldozed the site after the strike. We know that the Israelis helped their strike by launching a cyber attack against the Syrian air defense radar systems. This attack essentially caused them to not see the Israeli F-16s. Now, the geography in the Middle East is tight enough that the first warning the Syrians had was when the explosion started, by which time the F-16s were almost back across the Israeli border. However, that's not quite so feasible when you start thinking about the reactor that the Iranians have put together and the work that they're doing. So on the left-hand side, you can see the path flown by the Israelis to hit an Iraqi reactor back in 1981. In that particular case, incredibly dangerous operation. We don't know to this day whether the Saudis didn't pick up the Israeli warplanes or just turned a blind eye to it. And the Saudis aren't telling us, and we're too polite to ask. Next slide, please. When the Iranians started enriching uranium, they were doing so in a distant enough point that it would be almost impossible for the Israelis to launch a strike. And the Israelis are the ones that have proven in the area they are both willing and capable to do so. Now, the Israelis conducted some air defense exercises where they flew west into the Mediterranean Sea the exact distance that it would take to hit the Iranian reactor if they flew in the opposite direction, and this was a bit of a messaging exercise. But they would have to fly over Iraqi airspace. At the time, the United States was still controlling the Iraqi airspace, and we refused permission to the Israelis to even consider flying across that space. Somebody, and according to the New York Times, it was the United States working with Israel, but nobody has ever taken public credit for it. Somebody created a cyber attack that relied upon 4 different zero-day exploits. These are the bugs in code that you can potentially go after. Whoever created this virus created the most complex computer attack that had ever been seen to date. They knew exactly what kinds of machines the Iranians were running. They knew exactly what kind of programmable logic controllers ran said machines. And they were reasonably certain that because the Iranians had not developed the enrichment technology themselves, they would not notice when the system started behaving erratically, or they would not know how to react. Now, when you're driving your car to come to work every day, you know what the engine sounds like, particularly when you step on the gas to merge onto the interstate. When it makes a different noise, if you're a good enough mechanic, you may know exactly what it is. But even if you don't know anything about cars, you recognize a different sound, and you know that's not good. In this particular case, the code that managed to make its way onto the Iranian systems, which they thought were protected because they were not connected to any outside networks, but which were not protected enough because they still had USB ports, and somebody plugged a flash drive in and uploaded the code. When that code got in there, it changed the speed at which the centrifuges turned. It essentially accelerated them and slowed them down, accelerated them and slowed them down. And it did it over a period of several months. This essentially caused the motors to burn out. But the Iranian technicians that were working in the enrichment facility did not know that that change in the frequency and change in the sound of the machines was actually a problem. So they didn't report the fact that there was something wrong, and about 20% of their centrifuges wound up essentially burning out their motors. It became a little more obvious that something nefarious was going on when somebody started shooting Iranian nuclear scientists. Again, we're not exactly sure who was doing it, but they had a bad habit of riding up on a motorcycle, opening fire, and then riding away. So whoever it was had good human sources on the ground. It's a way to potentially take down a system like a nuclear reactor without an overt act of war. Next slide, please. So, quick overview. Where we were. Military robotics are not new. We've been fielding these things for more than 100 years in fairly rudimental fashion. Why does that matter? Because RMAs don't happen immediately. They are a gradual process. You can tell when they're going on if you pay attention to what's going on around you, but you don't immediately say, oh, and on this day, we suddenly had an RMA. Rather, it's a gradual thing. Whether it's the flying torpedo called the Kettering bug on the upper left that was designed and tested during World War I, or whether it's the V-1 flying bomb, a far more sophisticated version in the lower right, these were both examples of finding ways to launch strategic attacks on the enemy without having to fight your way through their defenses. The Germans during World War II created the Goliath. This is about a 200-pound tracked vehicle. It's remotely driven. It was designed to essentially be a mobile anti-tank mine. It didn't work that well because it was wire guided, and the wires could be fairly easily cut with artillery bombardments. As a result, we found a bunch of Goliaths in 1945 that were essentially being held in reserve for bridge detonation programs. The Soviets in 1939 invented the teletank. This was a remotely driven tank. The way that you drove it was you sat in a different tank about 2 miles away, and radio signals allowed you to drive the tank. It didn't have any real good feedback mechanisms, so it wasn't particularly accurate. It didn't work very well, and when they deployed them against the Finns thought these things were just hilarious. Next slide, please. Okay, also where we were. In 1986, the United States and Israel worked together to create the AAI Pioneer. This was essentially designed as a battle damage assessment system. It was also an artillery spotter. During the Gulf War, some Iraqi soldiers actually attempted to surrender to a Pioneer. They managed to successfully signal the operators of the Pioneer, who then got a battleship bombardment canceled. So they were under bombardment, and they managed to signal and save their lives, although they obviously went into captivity for a while. On the upper right hand there, you can see the Teledyne Ryan Firebee. This was a traditional target drone that some cameras were added to fly it over territories that were too unsafe for human reconnaissance missions. In the center here is the one that's truly creepy. And here's where the things of nightmares start to begin. Kevin Warwick is a British researcher, and Warwick thought it was a good idea to have a microchip implanted surgically in his wrist. This thing was basically driven into the nerves just inside of his wrist, and once they managed to figure out exactly what the electrical impulses were at inside of his wrist, he was able to start controlling the mechanical hand using only his mind. Now, that's impressive, and it's kind of handy, but that's not the creepy part. About 2 months later, his wife had the same operation and had one implanted in her hand and was able to then essentially telepathically control Kevin's hand. If she made a fist, she could force his hand into a fist whether he liked it or not. My wife likes to be in charge. There's limits. Next slide, please. Okay. Where we are now, you can see how Warwick's idea starts to expand. In the lower left-hand side here, what we're seeing is the development of mind-controlled prosthetics. We now have the capability to allow someone to control a hand using implants, not just using muscle connections, which was the old way. And using force feedback technology, they can actually feel the fingertips of the hand that they're controlling. It sends a signal back to their brain. Now, it takes some training, but some of the earliest users of this particular device who had had their arms amputated, not in the interest of science, had their arms amputated, they're now able to pick up an egg and crack it using just a mechanical hand. It's bringing back a lot of capabilities to them that they thought they had lost forever. We've seen significant improvements in air defense systems, such as the Israeli Iron Dome, which became operational in 2011. We're also seeing the creation of essentially a mechanical mule. That's the big dog on the lower right-hand side. It's capable of carrying about 400 pounds of gear and keeping up with dismounted infantry. It can go pretty much anywhere humans can. There's some really disturbing videos of it on YouTube, crossing an icy lake, going up a hill that's at about a 35-degree angle. It's a little disturbing. Now, it's not great for sneaking up on people. It's about as loud as a lawnmower. So you're definitely not going to use this thing in any kind of a covert operation, but it's out there. And obviously, you're all familiar with the Reaper. The Reaper has become the quintessential robotic system of the war on terror. Using devices like this allow you to propagate war without putting your own personnel precisely in harm's way. However, they also make it in some ways more difficult to adhere to the laws of war. It's almost impossible to take prisoners if your primary mode of warfare is through RPAs. Next slide, please. Where we're going. We're seeing a lot of positive developments from robotics. Those mind-controlled prosthetics, in particular, legs have worked out very, very well with those. It's phenomenal what we're able to do. We now have some quadriplegics that have effectively been outfitted with exoskeletons that are mind-controlled. So they are now capable of walking slowly and somewhat clumsily, but we're making enormous progress. But there's some really kind of disturbing stuff out there, too. In the 1990s, we experimented with a program called LOCAS, which is on the lower right-hand side there. Now, this particular program is essentially a tube-launched, 4-hour loiter time, fully autonomous killing machine. once you launch it, you don't control it from the ground anymore. Instead, it loiters over an area looking for pre-programmed targets. Now, when this thing was first designed, it was supposed to go out and destroy Soviet tanks. The idea is that we would just flood the battlefields with these things. They can fire 3 rounds of anti-tank weapons and then turn themselves into a 4th anti-tank weapon, essentially a kamikaze dive at a 4th target. They're very, very good at hitting those targets. They're not good at discriminating between targets that have been hit and targets that haven't. But that's 20 years ago. And thanks to the advent of cloud computing and essentially the ability to share information with each other, it can be a phenomenally capable system now. The LOCAS itself has long since been shelved. We never deployed the thing. But I want you to imagine marrying a LOCAS system with the new Hitachi facial recognition system. That facial recognition system can compare up to 30 million faces per minute. And it can do so at a 45-degree angle. Which means if you were to put that facial recognition system into a camera on a large loitering platform, particularly one with autonomous decision-making capability to kill, you could create essentially a flying assassination device. And there are plenty of people that are pushing for exactly that. Now you load it with whatever photos you have of individuals like Osama bin Laden, and you start flying it anywhere you think he might be hiding, and it might be able to react almost instantly to a detection and launch a munition. Next slide, please. Some of the other places that we're going. Centibots. These are incredibly simple systems. You can take 100 centibots and give them 3 programmed, essentially, commands. 1, move around. 2, report back what you see. 3, stay away from other centibots. You can then unleash them on a city the size of Omaha, and in under a week, they will map every single street, every single building, and were all the doors to be left open, they would be capable of mapping the interior of every building as well. It's simple programming. This is not a complex thing. All they do is send it back to whatever they see, and it's essentially assembled into one big map. The AeroVironment Switchblade, this is basically a handheld, tube-launched, short loiter time munition. It's kind of like the anti-tank system of the future in many ways. Tactical microbots are now being designed. They're small enough you might not notice one if it flew into your office. Micro swarms that are capable of flying around, mapping areas, doing facial recognition, they're already in existence. Slide, please. So, final point. Anwar al-Awlaki, in my opinion, not a good person. You might have heard of him, though he's been out of the news for a while. He was born in the United States. He does become the face of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So he's an American citizen that radicalizes and becomes a foremost conductor of the war against the United States. He's from Yemen, from a Yemeni family. That's where he's going to retreat back to once he becomes radicalized. Next slide, please. Anwar al-Awlaki was in touch with all of these individuals. So you have Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter. You've got some of the 9/11 perpetrators. You've got the Times Square bomber, the underwear bomber. He was in communication with them. That does not mean that he actually ordered all of these people to do all of the things that they did. However, he was a fundamental part of radicalizing each of these individuals and encouraging them to carry out jihad any way that they could. Next slide, please. Al-Awlaki becomes a major target, and he gets put on essentially what's often referred to as the kill list. It's actually a UN Security Council Resolution 1267 list, and the United States essentially is announcing this is who we're going to go after. Now, it used to be that list was publicly accessible. Very hard to find now, but it used to be that it was publicly accessible. And as a result, Al-Awlaki's father actually filed a lawsuit to try to get him removed from the list on the grounds that his son had not been convicted of any crime in a U.S. court, and therefore the government should not be attempting to kill him. His suit was thrown out for lack of standing. Effectively, the federal court said the only person that can file to get off the list is the person that's on the list. So we're going to need your son to come to court and file a petition, and then we promise not to kill him, and that's a pretty fair deal. Not surprisingly, Al-Awlaki himself did not agree. He stayed in Yemen, thought that he was perfectly safe. Yemen, not normally considered part of the war on terror, though there had been some strikes in the area. We had an awful lot of RPAs that were effectively hunting him. We had one particular incident where we almost got him. He and a few individuals basically swapped cars. he was snuck away, we hit the car that he had been riding in and killed a couple of al-Qaeda operatives. Now in this particular case, what we have is an American citizen, though, that's been targeted by his own government. And that's problematic for a lot of people. Eventually we get him. He's actually killed while riding in a car with another individual, Samir Khan, who had formed the al-Qaeda magazine Inspire, and also an American citizen, also on the kill list. Next slide, please. And here's the thing. I am not sad that al-Awlaki is gone. I think he's a horrible human being, and he was doing awful things and trying to kill people. And I think that an attack on al-Awlaki probably saved a lot of American lives. He was an incredibly dangerous individual. However, I do have some qualms about the U.S. government essentially targeting American citizens, even horrible ones, without any significant degree of judicial oversight. Next slide, please. In my mind, you need to actually have some form of an indictment or some form of judicial oversight. It is easier, in theory, it is easier to put someone on the kill list than it is to subject them to surveillance. And that's a fundamental problem for me. Next slide, please. Now, you have the right to a public trial. This is once again a case of we need to follow our own laws because we're trying to uphold the order that we have created. You have the right to the assistance of counsel, etc. Slide, please. Why does this fundamentally matter? Well, when the government killed al-Awlaki, the president took a bit of a victory lap. We were very happy about what we had done. This was proof that nobody was safe in al-Qaeda. But what we didn't know at the time of the victory lap was that the 16-year-old in the middle there, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was living in Yemen, who was al-Awlaki's son, who had not seen his father in the better part of a decade, he had gone to try to find his father. He'd snuck away from his grandparents' home, hopped on a bus, gone to the city where it was rumored his father was living. The reality is his father was already dead by the time he got on that bus. 2 weeks after al-Awlaki was killed in an airstrike, we killed his son and 7 of his friends. They were sitting at a coffee shop and they were hit by a missile. They were killed. The destruction was so great that they couldn't distinguish the body parts. They had to bury them all together. Now, when that happened, al-Awlaki's grandparents publicly asked, "Why did you kill our grandson?" And the response from the White House was that Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was a 21-year-old al-Qaeda operative actively engaged in warfare against the United States. Next slide, please. To which the family produced his birth certificate and proved that he was a 16-year-old kid. Now, that was a little embarrassing because the administration had openly come out and been wrong. But intel mistakes happen. It's war. Things like that will occur. So the government backtracked a little bit and said, actually, we were wrong. What happened was we were targeting the man sitting next to Abdul Rahman, Ibrahim al-Bana. And that's what happened. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you don't want to get hit by a strike, don't sit next to bad people. Except we had Ibrahim al-Bana under surveillance in Cairo at the same time. And so this was a case of our agencies not really talking to each other. When that got pointed out, the government has not actually commented on the death of Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki ever since. Next slide, please. So where do we not want to go? In my opinion, military robotics drive us towards using the military as the first response to anything that we think violence might be effective against. Military robotics make it easy for politicians to think that they can conduct a war without taking casualties. And that is just not the case, because it opens the door to other countries following our lead. There's more than 100 countries currently using robotic systems, but the United States has fielded and deployed a lot more and a lot more lethal systems than anyone else. In my opinion, that is a very dangerous path to tread, and it's time to put some limits on it. Thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions that you might have. Sir.
Sir, so it doesn't take much of an imagination to see how you could apply this technology in such a way that would undermine the nuclear deterrent. Do you see that happening, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, nuclear deterrence is the thing that has kept us safe for 75 years. There's no question about that. What you do every day is vital to our survival. No question at all. But even after the advent of nuclear weapons, what we've seen is essentially nations and non-state actors trying to figure out where our threshold really is. Kind of a creeping approach. And because these tend to be, at the tactical level, such a smaller type of operation, there's no likelihood of us retaliating with nuclear weapons against the use of these smaller things that are undoubtedly conventional. Now, there's nothing that would technically stop you from creating a nuclear RPA other than the need to have that level of nuclear technology. So there are very few countries that could do it right now. But do I think it's really undermining nuclear deterrence? No, not really. I don't think the United States has faced really a national survival level threat for at least 2 centuries. And arguably, we haven't faced one since the American Revolutionary War. Nuclear deterrence is probably the #1 reason for that. There's simply no way to overwhelm the United States. But there is the possibility of dealing with all of our interests around the world. Because in the same way that we're not going to retaliate with nuclear devices for a small-scale attack, we're also unlikely to retaliate with nuclear devices for any kind of attacks on American interests in the world. We're more likely to either fight back conventionally or pull back from the area. So I don't know if that...
So what I was getting at is, do you see where this technology could be used by, say, by anybody who has it to render the stability from the nuclear deterrent irrelevant? In other words, we don't have any defense to stop them from negating a nuclear deterrent, and that creates instability.
So you could use these devices... What's that? Okay, he's going to talk more about it, but let me just give you a quick answer, which is you could use these devices in a twofold fashion. One, you could actually use them in a direct attack on nuclear forces because they're so versatile and because you can do so much damage if you get to the right place with even a small amount of power. But number two, you can actually have a lot of the same effects as you might have with nuclear weapons in terms of human casualties. You know, if you took those centibots that I described that could go map a city, and you armed them instead and said basically kill anything that's more than 30 inches tall, there's nothing that would really stop you from doing that if you wanted to do that, and the effects could be devastating on the human population while leaving the city itself largely untouched. That's a horrible future that I hope we never reach. Sir, I know I saw a hand right down front here.
Yeah, mine
Sir.
was, you talked about some limits that we should place on the utilization of various. Do you have any recommendations or ideas that?
So for me, there's no way you're going to ban military robotics. They're too useful, they're too propagated, but there are some examples from history where we have banned things without having to use them against each other first. So you look at the Biological Weapons Convention, for example. That was a case where we all went, ooh, that's a bad idea, don't do that. When you look at even like chemical weapons bans, in that case we had to use them against each other in World War I and then say let's not do that anymore. When it comes to this sort of stuff, that's why I bound it by saying what you need is an international convention banning autonomous, offensive, lethal machines. It's a very narrow window. Nobody has deployed those yet. We have created devices that can do it. Nobody has actually unleashed them. My fear is once somebody does, they're going to be so frightfully useful, it's going to be very hard to put the genie back into the bottle. But there's ample precedent to suggest that none of the big five really wants this. They're all kind of developing them out of fear of what everybody else is doing. And so if you can get the big five on board, then the rest of the world will fall in line or will face substantial consequences. They're unlikely to buck the system. And there's actually a huge movement to do this right now. If you want to know more about that, you can look at the Future of Life Institute. Elon Musk is one of the founders of it. A lot of other forward-thinking futurists have signed on and basically said, this is the one thing you've got to ban. You can use them defensively, and that's fine. That's actually probably a good thing because it creates a significant area denial and deterrent effect in the conventional realm. But maybe don't allow a machine to kill a human without a human making the decision first.
A little bit like landmines.
Very much so. The difference being, obviously, a landmine doesn't decide to move itself. The landmine gets in place. Now, there are mobile landmines, and those things drive us nuts. Just the notion of them. These are mines that are designed to move themselves, essentially to make sure that the pattern changes constantly. They're absolutely terrifying. But that's true of a lot of stuff. I don't sleep well. I'm not. not good at this. I know we're short on time, but we'll be happy to answer more questions after or during the break.
Well, I think we saw by some of the questionable content that we can throw pretty much in you.
Yeah, we'll just get rid of those slides, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's take 5-10 minutes for a comfort break. Come back, which we're gonna then start with future warfare concepts. And again, if you need to come in, go out as needed, please do so. Thank you for your participation.